People are extremely weird. So weird, in fact, that there is an entire field of science, psychology, devoted to answering the question of why are people so weird? And so today we're gonna explore the psychology iceberg. Now, for the couple of you that don't know what an iceberg chart is, basically the things at the bottom are very esoteric and weird, the things at the top are very well known and normal. Alright, I think we can stop fucking around and actually start. So, the first entry is going to be projection. Projection is a defense mechanism where people project, hence the name, their undesirable qualities and flaws upon other people. For example, a Reddit mod complaining that other people smell bad. Now, the reason why people project could range from a lack of self-awareness to a simple coping mechanism, but whatever the case may be, I think it's always important to be humble and self-aware enough to catch yourself doing that. Because yeah, it sounds ridiculous to project your own faults upon other people, but at the end of the day we're all pieces from the same cloth, we're all humans, and we are all capable of doing it. But I digress. Anyway, let's move on. Next entry, learning styles. This one refers to how different people have a preferred way of learning, a learning style, if you will. Some people prefer learning through pictures or videos, some through listening to audio, some through reading, etc, etc, etc. I really like this one in particular because there is a common misconception that there is a quote-unquote correct way to learn. A lot of people say that one method of learning is superior to others, and this is objectively false, because we know that people learn differently through different learning styles. So all of you self-improvement cells out there can stop thinking you're the second coming of Einstein just cause you read books. Next entry, 16 personalities. This one refers to a personality test called the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, which is based on theories of Carl Jung. This test categorizes individuals into one of 16 personality types, each characterized by 4 dichotomous preferences. Said preferences being the following: 1. Extroversion versus introversion, 2. Sensing versus intuition, 3. Thinking versus feeling, and 4. Judging versus perceiving. This one is quite boring. I don't got too much to say about it, it's just a personality test that, by the way, isn't all that accurate. So yeah, it's pretty trash. Let's move on. Serotonin hypothesis. The serotonin hypothesis proposes the idea that low levels of serotonin, a hormone that makes you feel good, might lead to depression. It is important to remember though that depression is much like the ingredient list of a McDonald's meal. There is a lot going on here. So suggesting that this one thing is the sole cause of depression is amateurish at best and downright dangerous at worst. So this hypothesis remains for now just that. Next entry, Munchausen syndrome. Try saying that one 10 times fast. But anyway, this syndrome is a disorder where an otherwise healthy person pretends to be ill, typically to gain attention. TikTok. On a more serious note, this syndrome is quite problematic, because individuals with this syndrome might go to great lengths convincing others that they are indeed sick, leading at times to false diagnosis and inability to identify the syndrome. Next entry, free will. This one is pretty self-explanatory, but we'll go through it anyway. The concept of free will refers to the idea that every decision and action you take is entirely decided by you. Which I completely agree with, by the way, because this idea promotes personal agency. Since if everything you do is entirely up to you, then it is also entirely your responsibility. Next entry, everyone is unique. This one also speaks for itself. Every person is unique and special. However, this entry in particular is in quotation marks, so it might be sarcastic. So in that case, I think it might refer to a paradox that if everyone is unique, then no one is. Because if being unique is normal, then everyone is not unique, everyone is normal. It could also refer to how while we all might be different, we're not all that different. At the end of the day, we're all humans and we all have similarities, so we're not as different from one another as we might assume. But yeah, that's about all my peanut brain could come up with for this entry. Let's move on. Neurodiversity. Speaking of every person being unique, neurodiversity refers to how there are neurological differences between individuals, including behavior, learning styles, cognitive functioning, etc. So I suppose this one is basically a rephrasal of the previous entry, except with more nerdy scientific terms. Next entry, dark psychology. Dark psychology is basically the edgy side of psychology. It's basically if psychology got cheated on by his girlfriend and started a villain arc. But jokes aside, it essentially involves the study of unethical psychological principles for malicious intents like manipulation, abuse, or deception. And the reason why this entry is in quotation marks is because dark psychology isn't the scientific agreed upon definition for the topic. I think. If I'm wrong on that one, then blame ChatGPT. Next entry, moral essentialism. Moral essentialism is the idea that morality is objective and fixed regardless of religion, culture, or location. This idea mainly stands on things like how killing is bad and looked down upon among pretty much any culture. But this idea doesn't take into account how, while some things may be acceptable in one culture, they might be blasphemous in another culture, like for example eating pork. So this idea is probably too simplistic to be accurate. Next entry, trauma. The definition of trauma is an event or emotional response that is beyond one's ability to cope and handle it. This was a gross oversimplification of an extremely complicated concept, but you could honestly make an entire Iceberg video just about trauma, so cut me some slack. It should be mentioned though that trauma is going to manifest in different ways from person to person, and while trauma might be extremely overwhelming and distressing, a person can still live a productive, healthy life while carrying severe trauma if handled well. Next entry, empaths. So you know how psychopaths are people who lack empathy? Well, empaths are the exact opposite. Empaths are supposedly people who have a heightened ability to empathize with people. However, the scientific evidence of this concept remains limited. Next entry, constructivism. This entry refers to a theory that suggests that when you learn something, you don't just passively consume the information, but rather you actively construct a view on the information in your mind. This theory is very significant as it opposes the traditional approach to education, which involves a person puking as much knowledge as he can on the learner while the learner is supposed to just passively listen. A constructivist approach to learning would involve the learner taking on a more active role, perhaps through discussing the information or through experimenting with it. Next entry, gender identity. Gender identity, as the name suggests, is the gender you identify as, regardless of your actual biological gender. Now, I personally don't get why it's so important to some people. I don't understand why some people want so badly to be referred to as male, female, or I don't know, a fucking car. But I mean, it doesn't hurt anyone, so you do you. And that was it for tier 1, and now we can move on to tier 2. And our first entry in tier 2 is going to be DSM, also known as the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. The DSM is a list of mental disorders that provides criteria for the diagnosis and the classification for said mental disorders. It is widely used even by professionals including psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, etc. However, the DSM has been criticized for sometimes diagnosing when not needed and for being overall a bit too simplistic, especially in an extremely complicated and nuanced field like psychology and mental health. Also, fun fact, the DSM at one point referred to being trans as a mental illness, which I think some people to this day would agree with, but I'm not going to state my stance on that one because I don't want to be cancelled. Anyway, let's just move on. Comorbidity. It's one heck of a strange word, and a strange word that you can bet took me a bunch of times to say right, but I digress. Anyway, said weird word refers to the presence of 2 or more mental disorders in one person. For example, if a person has depression and anxiety. Next entry, Dark Triad. The Dark Triad is a set of 3 personality traits that tend to sometimes manifest as manipulative, antisocial, and generally immoral. Those traits are 1. Narcissism, an excessive focus and obsession with the self. 2. Machiavellianism, a willingness to exploit and deceive others regardless of moral or ethical consequences, named after the philosopher Niccolo Machiavelli, who, as you can guess, probably wasn't a great guy. And 3. Psychopathy, a lack of empathy toward fellow people. Funnily enough, those successful politicians and businessmen tend to have those traits, because when you don't mind exploiting others, you have more opportunities for success. But, of course, an individual with some or all those traits is not necessarily going to be a fucking serial killer. Next one, cognitive functions. Cognitive functions are mental processes and abilities that allow people to understand and interact with the world around them. Those functions include perception, attention, memory, language, and more. Next entry, IQ. IQ is a measure of intelligence that is assessed by certain tests. Those tests assess one's intelligence through testing different aspects of cognitive functioning, such as verbal comprehension, logical reasoning, spatial visualization, and processing speed. Although while IQ has its merits, it's still limited in certain respects. Next entry, cultural differences in mental disorders. The name kind of gives it away, but yeah, there are differences in different mental disorders from culture to culture. Some disorders might be more common or be perceived differently from culture to culture. For example, the depression rates in the US are around 5.9%, while in Norway it's about 4.7%. In some cultures, some disorders might even manifest differently. For example, in a culture where it's widely accepted to express emotions, individuals might cry and express their struggle to other people, while in cultures where you're told to suck it and man up, individuals might suffer in silence. Side note, I know how it feels when you feel like you have no one to talk to, but trust me, you have probably someone to talk to. You probably have someone who cares about you, so yeah, keep going, I believe in you, you got this. Now, next entry, personality disorders. Personality disorders are a group of mental health conditions that are defined by continuing patterns of behavior, cognition, and inner experience that deviate from cultural expectations and cause significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of life. Such conditions include psychopathy, a severe lack of empathy, borderline personality disorder, and instability in mood, emotions, and self-image. Schizoid personality disorder, not to be confused with schizophrenia, is characterized by detachment from social relationships and limited emotional expression. Now, there are obviously a lot more personality disorders, but I'm not a fucking Wikipedia page, so I'm not gonna list all of them. Next, attachment styles. Attachment styles are the patterns in which we tend to form bonds and relationships with different people. Attachment styles include 1. Secure attachment, typically described as the most healthy attachment style. This one includes an ability to be comfortable with intimacy while also being respectful and understanding of other people's needs. 2. Anxious preoccupied attachment involves being overly clingy or dependent on another person. And 3. Avoidant attachment involves avoiding or dismissing people, closure, and intimacy, typically due to fear or insecurity. Attachment styles are believed to develop in the early stages of our life through the interactions with our parents, particularly interactions that involve responding to our needs. For example, if your dad left to buy milk and never came back, you might develop an anxious attachment style and become clingy, because you constantly fear that people might leave or betray you. That being said, people can always work on their insecurities and trauma in order to become a more healthy and secure person. Next one, behaviorism. Behaviorism is an approach to psychology that focuses on observing the environment's effect on behavior rather than internal factors like thought and emotion. Now, I personally think that it has some validity. There is no doubt that your environment is going to affect your behavior. However, through the way I see it, I think that your environment can really only affect your thoughts and emotions, and thoughts and emotions themselves are the true sole determiners of behavior. So what I'm trying to say is that your environment doesn't change your behavior, but rather your environment changes your thoughts and emotions, and your thoughts and emotions do change your behavior. So yeah, I think it made sense and that I sounded really smart right now. And now starting off tier 3 with reification of diagnosis. This one refers to the tendency to treat mental diagnosis as concrete concepts with fixed boundaries rather as abstract constructs used for classification and understanding. This phenomenon can lead to the overemphasis of diagnostic labels and the overlooking of individual variability and complexity within mental health conditions. It's always crucial to remember that diagnoses are just abstract concepts we use for clarity and to better understand how to find a treatment for the person in question. Additionally, each person's case is always going to differ. That's just the way it is. So, if a person has X problem, an X solution may not necessarily help. But I think it's especially the people themselves who get the diagnosis that especially should remember that diagnoses are just made up, abstract concepts. In fact, I myself had a diagnosis a few years ago, and it made me feel like I was inadequate and defective. So remember, a diagnosis doesn't make you any less of a person. A diagnosis is merely a made up, abstract concept used to find a way to help you. Diagnoses don't change who you are or make you any less of what you are. And that's of course without even mentioning that diagnoses literally only exist because we say they do. Next entry, dimensionality of mental disorders. This one refers to the concept of seeing mental health conditions in a continuous spectrum instead of distinct separate categories. This approach acknowledges that different conditions are going to manifest differently between person to person. So it's probably more of a realistic approach to mental conditions because psychology, as we've already established, is an extremely nuanced field where rigidity doesn't help much. Speaking of rigidity, next, serotonin hypothesis is wrong. So the serotonin hypothesis is not necessarily wrong, but as we've established earlier, there is a lot going on with depression, so it's important to approach the serotonin hypothesis for what it is, a hypothesis, a theory. But hey, that's just a theory, a psychology theory. Shout out to Matt Pett. Anyway, let's move on. Mental disorders aren't purely pathological. This entry suggests that mental disorders aren't always bad. Mental conditions are a little more nuanced than just it's bad. For example, autism is a mental disorder, and yet people with autism sometimes have better cognitive functions like attention to detail and memory. By the way, it is to be expected with something like psychology, but by this point you should get used to hear the word nuance a lot in this video because, as I said, psychology is a very nuanced field, so that's to be expected. Anyway, next entry, inadequate treatment options. Excuse me for repeating myself yet again, but yeah, as I said 5 seconds ago, psychology is a very nuanced field. And so different conditions will manifest differently in different people, and so will the appropriate treatment for said conditions. A treatment that will be very effective for one person is going to be very inadequate for another person. So a lot of treatments are going to be inadequate, unfortunately, hence the name of the entry. I think. Keep in mind I might be totally wrong on some of those entries because I'm not a fucking professor, I'm just using Google and ChatGPT to research those things, so I might find totally unrelated things. But hey, as long as we learn a couple new things, then who cares? Next entry, replication crisis. The replication crisis is an issue in all of science and not just in psychology, where researchers attempt to repeat a study to confirm its results and often end up getting completely different results to the original study. The replication crisis is a much needed reminder that studies should always be viewed with skepticism because they could always have unreliable or exaggerated results. Next entry, moral psychology. As the name suggests, moral psychology is a field of psychology that explores, you guessed it, the psychology of morals. More specifically, how we develop moral values, make moral judgments, and engage in moral decision making. So yeah, pretty neat, I give it my stamp of approval. And that was it for tier 3, and now we can move on to tier 4. Starting off with, DSM is an outdated research paradigm. The DSM, as we covered earlier, has been criticized and seen by many as outdated. The reason why the DSM is seen as invalid by some is because of its rigidity and simplicity. The DSM tends to give treatments and diagnosis while neglecting the variability of conditions between people, and also it tends to classify conditions into categories instead of using a more dimensional approach. There are more reasons as to why some people aren't big fans of the DSM, but it's just bound to happen. At the end of the day, the more well-known something is, the more criticism it's bound to get, and the DSM is extremely well known in psychology. But despite its shortcomings, the DSM still has its uses and it still continues to be used in clinical practice and research. Next entry, the diametric model. The diametric model is a framework in psychology that is used to make things easier and simpler to understand. This model suggests that psychological traits don't exist in one singular spectrum, but rather exist independently, separate of each other. For example, instead of viewing extroversion and introversion as two ends of the same spectrum, the diametric model suggests that they are two distinct entities altogether that exist independently of each other. Since a person can be very introverted under some circumstances, while very extroverted under other circumstances. As for if it's correct, quote unquote, well, it's not correct, nor is the conventional way to view traits as spectrums correct. It's simply just another way to look at things. Next, genomic imprinting. Genomic imprinting is a very interesting phenomenon where the expression of certain genes is influenced by if you received the gene from your dad or mom. I guess you could say that it has to do with behavior since genes affect behavior, but I don't really see how this specific genetic phenomenon really relates that much to psychology, so let's just move on. Androgens. Androgens are a group of hormones, mainly testosterone, that are mainly associated with male development. Androgens exist in larger amounts in men, but they also exist in women, so the effects of androgens on psychology apply to either gender. Higher amounts of androgens tend to lead to a more conventionally masculine behavior, i.e., aggressive, dominant, confident, risk-taking, etc. Which is basically just me because of course I'm such an alpha male. Additionally, studies show that androgens might affect cognitive abilities and they might even have a link between mental disorders like anxiety, depression, and ADHD. Next entry, cognitive trade-offs. This one is a prime example of the statement master of one thing or jack of all trades. You can't be exceptional in all aspects of cognitive functions, that's just the way it is. For example, there is evidence to suggest that individuals with exceptional memory may exhibit deficiencies in other cognitive domains, such as attention or executive function. I find it kinda cool, honestly, because it's kinda like stats in a video game, if you know what I mean, where you can't max out all your stats, you only have so many points to put into each stat. Anyway, next one, group differences. This one is exactly what it sounds like. There are psychological differences between different groups of people due to differences in culture, genetics, environment, etc. Next, extreme male brain theory. This theory suggests that people with autism exhibit typical masculine behavior, like preference for system over emotion. This theory also suggests that the male brain is biologically predisposed towards understanding objective systems and rules, while the female brain is biologically predisposed to understanding emotions and feelings. This theory also says that in people with autism, the brain is overly focused, quote-unquote, on systemizing tendencies, leading to a struggle in understanding emotions, which would lead to difficulties in social situations. So basically, according to this theory, autistic behavior is masculine, I guess you could say. This one is pretty wacky, but also kinda interesting. Next one, gene-environment correlation. This one is about how genetic factors can influence the environments individuals are exposed to and vice versa. For example, if you grew up in a house where it's very common to exercise, you'll probably end up exercising as well. Or if you're naturally introverted, it'll probably make you naturally seek situations and places with less people. Next one is a word I'm probably going to butcher, but heterogeneity. As I already said, there are major differences between groups of people, but even within those groups there are major differences between individuals, which is what heterogeneity, or whatever you say it, is. Next one, another word I have no idea how to say, heritability. Heritability is like a measure of how much our differences in certain traits like height or intelligence are due to our genetics. It is often expressed as a stat ranging from 0 to 1. 0 means that genetics have nothing to do with the variable, and 1 meaning that genetics have everything to do with it. So heritability is basically a measure of if a certain trait is influenced more by nature or nurture. Overall, quite complicated but also quite interesting. And now we can move on to tier 5, and this is where things are going to get really wacky, even more wacky than they already got. Sexual selection of mental disorders. This one refers to how traits that are associated with certain mental disorders like creativity or risk-taking behavior may have been favored by sexual selection because they're perceived as attractive or because they may help you find a mate. So basically, according to this theory, being insane is hot. However, this concept remains theoretical. Next one, predictive processing. This entry is a theory that suggests that the brain constantly tries to make predictions about the future based on prior experiences. According to this theory, with this mechanism, it simplifies things for the brain and it leaves it with two simple choices. If the prediction came to be, then there is no need to do anything. If the prediction didn't come to be, then there is a need to adapt. Overall, pretty neat. Next, life history theory. This one is quite out there, but I'll do my best to explain it. Life history theory provides a framework for understanding the diversity of behaviors in animals and humans, considering evolutionary pressures and environmental conditions. Essentially, this theory suggests that different behaviors can be attributed to different mating strategies. For instance, individuals with a fast quote-unquote life history strategy might exhibit riskier behaviors or prioritize short-term gains, while those with a slow quote-unquote life history strategy might focus more on long-term planning, such as investing in education or career development. So basically, this theory is about how some people choose to speedrun life. By the way, there is a bird in the background that's making noises, and this bird is on a very tall tree, so I can't really get rid of it. So if you hear annoying noises in the background, that's why. Sorry about it. Anyway, next entry, motivational architecture of emotions. This concept suggests that emotions are not just random occurrences but are influenced by underlying motivations and goals. Just like how an architect designs a building with specific purposes in mind, our emotions are structured to serve particular functions related to our goals or desires. For example, fear may motivate us to avoid danger, while joy may encourage us to seek out rewarding experiences. This one is pretty much fact, in my opinion. I mean, besides helping the survival of the species, I really don't see why having emotions is useful, because evolution doesn't really give a fuck about our well-being. Evolution is really just concerned about survival and procreation. Evolution doesn't really give a fuck about if we're happy or sad. Next one, temperament. This one is basically your quote-unquote animalistic nature. It's often thought of as the foundation of our personality and behavior. Temperament is believed to be mostly genetic, reflecting biologically based predispositions that emerge early in life and that shape our responses to the world around us. Temperament can manifest in various ways, such as levels of activity, social ability, adaptability, and emotional reactivity. There was a lot of activity. Next entry, neurotransmitter systems. These are complicated systems within the brain and nervous system that influence various physiological and, you guessed it, psychological processes. The way they relate to psychology, other than the fact that they're crucial for healthy brain functioning, is that issues with those systems might lead to psychiatric disorders. Next one, meta traits. Meta traits include aspects such as assertiveness, enthusiasm, orderliness, compassion, and emotional stability. Meta traits are derived from the Big Five personality traits and provide a more nuanced understanding of individual differences. Basically, they're a more nuanced and comprehensive version of the Big Five personality traits. And now let's move on to Tier 6. Morality isn't real. This one has more to do with philosophy than psychology, but yeah, morality isn't real. Morality really only exists because we say it does. For example, we think killing is bad because the majority of us say it is. But if the majority of us would say that killing is good, then we would think that killing is good. Morality is not based on reality, it's based on our view of it. Therefore, it's not an objective concept that exists in reality. Therefore, morality isn't real. Next one, identity isn't real. This one basically says that identity isn't real because identity is mainly determined by your actions, which you can change at any time. For example, right now you might have the identity of a lazy person, but if you start working on something right now, you won't be acting like a lazy person, you'll be acting like a person who isn't lazy. So, are you still considered a lazy person? Identity is constantly changing, it's not a concrete, objective, clearly defined concept, so you could say it's not real, but in my opinion it is real. Next entry, schizophrenics are more logical. This one refers to observations that found that people with schizophrenia might exhibit heightened logical thinking compared to others. But this one is not really grounded in reality, pun intended. Next, dimensionality of genetic syndromes. This one refers to how different genetic syndromes can and will manifest differently from person to person. A perfect example would be autism. Autism is a condition that is considered to manifest mainly due to genetic factors, and autism could always manifest in an endless number of ways. So this dimensional approach reminds us that each person's case is completely unique. Next entry, addiction isn't real. I could honestly see the argument for this one, because addiction has to do with habits, and habits have to do with self-image, and self-image has to do with memories. So if you're addicted to, let's say, drugs, and I want to erase all your memories of you taking drugs, and thus get rid of your self-image as a drug addict, I would most likely also get rid of your habit of taking drugs, and thus of your addiction. So according to this thought experiment, addictions can only exist because we say they do and because we act like they do. However, this hypothetical thought experiment fails to take into account that there is such a thing as withdrawal symptoms. Next entry, facial morphology. Facial morphology refers to the physical structure of an individual's face. In psychology, research has explored how certain facial features may be associated with personality traits or even perceived trustworthiness, a phenomenon known as the halo effect, where more attractive people are perceived as more trustworthy, smart, funny, and things I wish I wore. Additionally, facial morphology plays a role in nonverbal communication, as facial expressions can convey emotions and intentions. And we're almost there, it's time for Tier 7, the semi-final tier, so we're almost there. Subcultures represent shared psychological traits. Subcultures often arise from shared interests, backgrounds, or experiences, which I suppose you could say happens due to shared psychological traits within individuals. But this one is kind of inaccurate and boring, so let's move on. Mental disorders are the true personality traits. This one is whack as fuck, but it has to do with how some symptoms of mental disorders can overlap with personality traits, leading to confusion about their distinction, while the profound impact of mental illness on identity may contribute to the sense of fusion between disorder and the self. So yeah, wacky as it gets, but it remains just that, a wacky, obscure concept that most actual psychologists would most likely scoff at. Next, political beliefs are underpinned by personality traits. I am quite shook that this entry is this far down the iceberg because I think this one is pretty obvious. Your personality is gonna affect your political beliefs. I mean, duh. For example, people with high levels of openness may be more likely to embrace liberal or progressive ideologies. Again, pretty obvious stuff, so not much to say here, so let's move on. Discussed inversion hypothesis of sexuality. And going from something that is very well known to something that is out there, to say the least. This hypothesis suggests that certain sexual behaviors, particularly those that may be considered taboo or socially unacceptable, like feet, urine, public sex, cuckolds, humiliations, are experienced as sexually arousing precisely because they invoke feelings of disgust. So this hypothesis basically proposes that disgust makes people feel pleasure, which is paradoxical when you think about it because disgust is the opposite of pleasure. As for why it happens, we don't know for sure, but I can think of a couple of reasons. Maybe unfamiliar taboo things invoke curiosity in people. Maybe it's because when you really think about it objectively like a robot, like really think about it objectively, sex is kinda gross. And also sex itself is a bit of a taboo topic that you're expected to not really talk about in public. So I guess that could explain the whole disgust inversion thing. Next entry, identity, political correctness, religion and racism share the same psychological cause. Probably not true, but one potential psychological commonality among those things could be the human tendency to categorize others based on social, cultural or ideological affiliations. This cognitive process, rooted in the need for social cohesion and understanding, may contribute to the formation of identity, adherence to political correctness, engagement with religion, and perpetuation of racist beliefs. Furthermore, factors such as socialization, personal experiences, and environmental influences play significant roles in shaping individual attitudes and behaviors regarding these topics. And we finally made it to the final tier, tier 8, so let's go! And the first entry in the final tier is going to be Unrotated Big 5. This entry refers to the unprocessed data obtained from personality assessments based on the Big 5 personality traits. Unlike the rotated versions of the Big 5, which are often used to simplify and interpret the data, the unrotated Big 5 scores provide a more detailed and nuanced view of an individual's personality profile at the cost of making it harder to interpret. Next entry, Empathy is socially deviant. While empathy is typically viewed as a positive thing, in certain social contexts or cultures, demonstrating empathy may be perceived as deviating from social norms or expectations. Demonstrating empathy might be seen as weak, inappropriate, or feminine in certain contexts and cultures. Like, for example, we are told to not express empathy toward criminals because they are quote-unquote bad. Next entry, Replication crisis isn't a crisis. Some people suggest that the replication crisis isn't a crisis, because with the scientific method, things like unreliable methods, results, or fake results are just bound to happen. Next, rationality is maladaptive. This one has to do with how sometimes being rational is counterintuitive and not suited for all situations. Being rational can sometimes lead to paralysis by analysis and lead to inaction or compromised performance due to nervousness resulting from the constant thinking of things like I might fail or this might fail. Additionally, in intimate situations in particular, it is best to quote-unquote turn off your rationale in order to allow yourself to be fully immersed in the moment. Next, and believe it or not, the final entry. Yeah, we finally made it. The final entry, which is pharmacological modification of personality. This one refers to the alteration of one's personality and behavior through drugs. This one is kind of self-explanatory since most drugs are gonna impact your brain chemistry and your brain has a direct effect on your behavior for obvious reasons. Some examples for drugs that affect behavior due to changes in brain chemistry are caffeine, anabolic steroids, antidepressants, alcohol, psychedelics, and plenty more. However, the ethics of using drugs to alter one's personality have been debated, especially in the case of antidepressants, which, ironically enough, are known to lead to significant decreases in mood and energy. And that was it for the psychology iceberg. It was way shorter than I expected it to be. I expected the video to come to like 2 hours. At the end it's gonna be like 50 minutes or 40 minutes, so yeah. And it's probably gonna be the last iceberg video that I ever make. It's not that making those videos is not fun or rewarding, it's just that making iceberg videos is so fucking it's hard to explain. It drains you. It drains the energy out of you. Like I see, there is this channel called Snook. I think that's how you say his name, Snook, and he uploads an Iceberg video every like 5 days. And I'm like, dude, how are you able to upload an Iceberg video like 5 days, every 5 days? That's insane to me. Like upload an iceberg video every 5 days and not completely lose your mind. That's insane, because those iceberg videos take so much energy out of you. It's hard to explain. It's like you need to do the research, and then you need to do the voiceover, and then you need to do the editing. It's a whole can of worms. It's weird. It's really as you can tell at this point, I don't really care about cutting times where I mumble, where I like at this point I just mumble because I want to. I don't really care about cutting stuff or editing stuff at this point. The video is over. If you liked it, then tell me you liked it. If you didn't like it, then tell me what you didn't like about it. And yeah, good night.